Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our Apparatus webinar featuring Apparatus technologist John Haynes as he presents Increase Your Confidence in Cloud Security. Before I hand things over, I would like to briefly introduce our speaker, John. John is an enterprise security architect and technology lead for Apparatus, an Indianapolis-based provider of advanced information technology consulting and managed services. John has a passion for providing strategic direction on security best practices, as well as explaining the concept behind information security to people who may not find themselves immersed in them every day, and he has 16 years of experience doing just this in both academic and corporate settings. Following the webinar, we'll have time for questions and answers, but feel free to send them over at any time. And just so you know, we will be recording. And now I'd like to hand it over to John, who will start our presentation.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Today's presentation is called Barriers to Cloud Adoption, as she said, and we're going to be covering several different topics today. I'm going to do a quick introduction, some sort of grounding in concepts, and then we're going to cover really briefly challenges in securing a cloud environment, top threats to cloud infrastructure and services, who's really responsible for cloud security, defense in depth technologies for the cloud, and recommendations for strengthening the protection of your cloud environment. So Mary Beth introduced me already, but just real briefly on top of that, I have a background in infrastructure, most notably web hosting infrastructure. Then I moved into architecture, and now I'm doing security architecture, which for me is basically like infrastructure with sort of an extra lens of security placed on top. And I really enjoy working in this particular field. What's all the excitement about cloud computing anyway? I mean, I'm excited, aren't you? It makes IT convenient, it's on demand, it's scalable, it's available, and things that were very difficult for traditional IT are made easy with cloud computing because computing resources are developed like a utility. You've got opportunities for cost reduction through efficiency, and you can rapidly design, provision, implement, and then decommission your computing resources all on the fly through the cloud. That being said, the cloud has an impact on data flow. Hosting components of your business in the cloud impacts the flow of your data, and it also impacts various security approaches that you need to take when considering what you need to think about when you're going to develop services in the cloud. Specifically, organizational, operational, and technological approaches to your data, your network, and just general good practices for information security. Security is security, sort of. Controls for security in cloud computing are pretty much, for the most part, no different than security controls in any other environment. But that being said, cloud computing does present slightly different risks to an organization than traditional IT solutions, and we will cover that. And lastly, CIA, no, not the Central Intelligence Agency. IT security is all about maintaining the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information, and this goes straight into cloud services as well. So challenges in securing a cloud environment. As an industry, enterprise is moving towards mobility-enabled cloud-delivered services. Consumers want to be able to access business resources from anywhere at any time, and using cloud services as well as mobility devices are enablers for this type of service consumption model. Inhibitors to this type of service consumption are security, performance, visibility, and control. Security cannot play catch-up here. It needs to be an upfront consideration and fully integrated, not bolted on in a series of gap fixes later. Users connecting to cloud services don't necessarily even need to be on your corporate network, so there can be a blind spot in company visibility, as well as a potential for lack of consistency in how you apply your corporate policies across the various types of devices. For example, you could have iPads that have different security policies in your environment than laptops do. From a security perspective, cloud services, scalability, and flexibility are a two-way street. Cloud services being concentrated together make a more attractive target, but at the same time, their defenses can be more robust and more cost-effective. Significant security risks with cloud computing include the tendency for business units to bypass IT departments and their information officers. Shifting to the cloud is affordable and fast, but businesses that are doing end runs around IT departments can undermine their corporate security policies, their corporate processes, and their corporation's best security practices. Without them, businesses can be vulnerable to security breaches that can very quickly erase any gains that they might have made by switching to cloud-based services in the first place. These are some high-level areas to focus on when you're considering the challenges of securing a cloud environment. Identity management. How are your users going to authenticate to a cloud service? Corporate identity management and single sign-on are preferred, but there are other options. Physical security. Is the physical infrastructure secure? Cloud services are usually provided from a world-class data center that takes into consideration such security threats as physical security, electricity redundancy, threats from fire and earthquakes, and that sort of thing. Personnel security. Are the administrators of your cloud services sufficiently trustworthy? Availability. Will your data be available when you need it? Application security. Is the way the cloud provider has implemented application security sufficient for your particular needs? Privacy. Is critical privacy data, like credit card numbers or social security or other personally identifiable information, masked or encrypted in the cloud? Who has access to it? And lastly, legal issues. Compliance, contracts, and e-discovery and all of their related laws compound to create legal issues for implementing cloud services. And these laws can vary by country, just making the matter even more complicated. So now we're going to talk about top threats to cloud infrastructure and services. The CSA is the Cloud Security Alliance, and it is a consortium of IT organizations that develop best practices and top threat reports for cloud infrastructure and services. Every year they publish a report that includes what they call their Notorious 9, which are the 9 biggest threats that they believe have the ability to impact cloud infrastructure and services. These include data breaches, data loss, account hijacking, and so on. Data breaches are not a new threat. It's just that the possibility of having your data in the cloud means that the multi-tenancy model of cloud can introduce a new avenue for data breaches to occur. The same is true with data loss, not just from malicious attackers, but accidents where your data is accidentally deleted by either your own customers or the content, the cloud provider. What's interesting is that data breaches and data loss actually have a rather weird inverse relationship with each other when you're looking to mitigate the risks from the two. For example, data breaches, one way to try and mitigate the risk of a breach occurring is to encrypt your data. However, if you ever lose the encryption key for that data, then that data is permanently lost and there's no way to retrieve it. Conversely, mitigating against data loss, you may have copies of your data offline for backup. But those extra copies of your sensitive data increase the surface area by which you might be breached. So the two sort of share this inverse relationship when you're looking to mitigate the two. The other threats listed here include account hijacking, where the cloud adds a new dimension to that landscape of a threat, in that phishing, fraud, and software vulnerabilities still get results. But using the cloud, a hacker or an attacker might be able to hijack credentials to use your cloud instance as a base of attack for attacking other clients or just causing general mayhem on the internet at large. Insecure APIs, including layered APIs, is another top threat. Denial of service, a frustrating but not new top threat in the CSA Notorious 9. Malicious insiders. The level of threat for malicious insiders is debatable in the security industry, but the actual threat of a malicious insider existing is very real. The cloud expands the scope of where that insider could be. It could now be not only in your own organization, but within the cloud service providers. Abuse of cloud services. This is an example of where power can be used for evil. For example, the ability to spin up large numbers of cloud compute resources can not only enable you to process your data quicker, but also enable a cloud service abuser to start doing brute force attacks on encryption keys, staging distributed denial of service attacks, serving up malware, etc. So this issue is for content service providers. How do they detect people abusing cloud services? How do they define it? And how do they prevent it? Insufficient due diligence, which I talked about briefly on one of the previous slides, refers to the sort of gold rush of businesses into the promise of cost reductions, operational efficiencies, and improved security around jumping into the cloud with both feet, but not doing due diligence to understand scope on the risks. By not taking on the diligence required to fully investigate cloud services before they deploy them, they could be taking on risks that they don't understand, or assuming that the content is risk-free because of the cloud provider, and that the cloud provider is responsible for the risk that they are not, contractually or otherwise. And then lastly, shared technology issues, where the scalability of the cloud means that there's a risk that a single vulnerability or a misconfiguration for one client in the cloud could lead to a compromise across the entire cloud and affecting multiple clients. ENISA is the European Network and Information Security Agency. They also publish an annual cloud computing risk assessment where they list what they believe to be the top threats to cloud infrastructure and services. What's interesting is that while there is some overlap with the CSA report, ENISA has several risks that they list that are different than what CSA lists for their notorious 9. For example, loss of governance. ENISA believes that in using the cloud, the client necessarily cedes control to the cloud provider on a number of issues which may affect security. And the SLAs that the cloud provider has may not offer commitment to cover those governance issues, leaving a security gap. Lock-in is another interesting threat in that there are really no tools, procedures, or standard data formats or service interfaces that could guarantee that your data, your applications, or your services are portable. This can make it difficult for a customer to migrate from one cloud provider to another, or to migrate their apps and data back in-house, which introduces a dependency on particular cloud providers. Isolation failure is the same as the CSA multi-tenancy issue, where you can have shared resources leading to risk of failures if isolation mechanisms fail. It is believed that this is low likelihood and very difficult to exploit, but the threat is still exists. Compliance risks is probably bigger for Europe than it is for the United States. But what they're referring to here is that when companies invest in industry certifications, those certifications can be put at risk by migration to the cloud if the cloud provider can't provide evidence of their own compliance with the relevant requirements. Meaning that you can fall out of a compliance by moving some of your data to a content or to a cloud provider if they're not also compliant with those same industry certifications, or if they don't allow audit by the customer. Management interface compromise refers to when customer management interfaces to the cloud are internet accessible and therefore pose an increased risk, especially when you combine it with remote access and web browser vulnerabilities. You wouldn't encounter this management interface compromise typically when you're using an in-house IT solution. Data protection refers to when the customer who's acting as a data controller may not be able to effectively check the data handling practices of a cloud provider and thus be sure that the data is handled in a lawful way. Some cloud providers do provide information on their data handling practices, and some offer certification summaries on their data processing, but others do not. So this can be a top threat. Another threat is insecure or incomplete data deletion. When a customer puts in a request with their cloud provider to delete some data, it is difficult for that customer to confirm with the cloud provider that the data has actually been deleted. And multi-tenancy can mean that it's impossible to truly delete the data if that data is on resources that are shared with other clients. And lastly, the malicious insider that I've already talked about. The third list of threats that I'd like to quickly take a look at is put out by Intel in their research reports on top threats. Interestingly, they have very little overlap with the previous two, and so I wanted to include them here to show that threats can be different types and impact in different ways. Intel sees the top threat as actually being internal security threats. Nearly 1/3 of security threats faced by companies today actually come from internal sources, and most of those are much more likely to be accidental than malign. In other words, you're much more likely to have internal employees that fall prey to phishing attacks than be actively plotting some sort of malicious intent. That's 1/3 of security threats are internal. Lack of ability to measure cloud provider security capabilities. Especially with public clouds, IT professionals are really concerned with the measurement of security capabilities as well as their control over them. Intel feels that there's a real lack of ways to measure security services of public cloud providers, which is a concern that's landed on the top of their list of concerns. This worry was closely followed by another concern about lack of control. In other words, general lack of control that we have in experiencing security controls in public cloud data centers. The dynamic and challenging regulatory environment. This is similar to one that Anissa talked about with regards to compliance, but the burdens of legal and regulatory compliance today really haven't been higher, both in demands and in penalties for non-compliance or breaches. Examples of regulatory controls include Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX, the Payment Card Industry's Data Security Standard or PCI DSS, and HIPAA or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Changing attackers and threats. It used to be that your biggest threat from an attacker was some sort of isolated single hacker looking to score some personal fame. But what we're seeing now is that more and more organized crime is driving well-resourced, sophisticated, and targeted attacks against cloud and internal IT infrastructure for the purpose of financial gain. And some of these attacks are actually government funded. Evolving architecture technologies. With the growth of virtualization, perimeters and their controls within the data center are in flux, and its data is no longer easily constrained or physically isolated or protected. And lastly, consumerization of IT. As mobile devices become much more common in the workplace, many employees are wanting to use BYOD or personally owned devices to access enterprise applications and enterprise data outside the normal confines of the corporate network and the data center. So who's responsible for cloud security? Security issues are faced by both cloud providers and their customers, and responsibility really does go both ways. The cloud provider needs to ensure that their infrastructure is secure and that their clients' data and applications are protected. The user of those cloud services needs to ensure that the provider has taken the proper security measures to protect their information and that they are taking measures to use strong passwords and authentication measures to access the data and applications that are in the cloud. We're going to talk a little bit about the SPI cloud deployment model. SPI is short for Service, Platform, and Infrastructure as Software, Platform, and Infrastructure as a Service, or SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. In general, the lower down the stack the cloud provider stops, the more security capabilities and management consumers are responsible for implementing and managing themselves. So let's explore that. Infrastructure as a service offerings typically include vendor responsibility or cloud provider responsibility for security up to the hypervisor, meaning that they only address security controls such as physical security of their data center, environmental security of that data center, and virtualization security for the host systems. Consumers of those cloud services, if it's an IaaS model, would be responsible for all other security controls that relate to the IT system, including the operating system, the applications, and the data. An example of IaaS would be Amazon's AWS EC2 cloud. Let's look at a table of IaaS division and responsibilities. As you can see here, the cloud provider, like I mentioned in the previous slide, handles physical support infrastructure, security and availability, and the host systems, while the customer is left responsible for just about everything else, including their identity management system, their authentication platform, as well as their password policies, their guest OS on the host systems, including patching and hardening, the configuration of security, including firewalls, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems, monitoring of their systems, maintenance of their firewalls and antivirus and packet filtering, log collection, monitoring, and application security. For platform and software as a service models, those offerings are basically the inverse of the infrastructure offering. Because the vendor provides the entire stack, they are responsible for not only the physical and environmental security controls, but also the controls on the infrastructure, applications, and data. This alleviates much of the consumer's direct operational responsibility. So let's look at a table of that. Here you can see that the cloud provider has most of the table that was previously on the customer side is now on the cloud provider, including security configuration, OS patch management, security platform maintenance, and logs. While the customer still needs to handle maintenance and management of their identity system, as well as authentication and password policy, and also compliance with data protection laws with respect to the customer data that they collect and process. They cannot pass compliance of data protection laws onto the cloud provider, since the customer is the one that is still collecting the data and processing that data. This figure shows how a cloud service mapping can be compared against compensating controls to determine which controls exist and which don't, as provided by the consumer, the cloud service provider, or a third party. This can in turn be compared to a compliance framework or a set of requirements. The way that the diagram is shown here, we have PCI DSS being the compliance model, and we have listed here all of the various compliance aspects that you would need to make sure you have covered in your security controls in your cloud. So what we're looking to do here is basically find the gaps. We're looking to cover the compliance requirements with our various security controls, and we can see where those security controls plug into the cloud model by looking at which SPI model we're looking to deploy. Once that gap analysis is complete, the requirements of any regulatory or other compliance mandates make it much easier to determine what needs to be done in order to feed into your risk assessment framework. This in turn helps determine not only where the gaps are, but also the risks that you need to address. And those risks can either be accepted, transferred, or mitigated. So let's talk a little bit about defense in depth for the cloud. Security and the benefits of scale. In general, all kinds of security measures are cheaper when they're implemented on a very large scale. So the same amount of security investment you make in the cloud will actually buy you better protection than if you were to try and implement them yourself in your own internal solution. These types of security measures can include filtering, patch management, hardening of the virtual machines and hypervisors, vetting of your employees and management of those employees, hardware and software redundancy, strong authentication including federated identity or two-factor authentication, role-based or context-based access control, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, and encryption. Other benefits of scale include multiple locations. Most cloud providers have the economic resources available to replicate your content in multiple locations by default. This not only increases redundancy, but it also provides independence from failure and provides a level of disaster recovery right out of the box. They also provide edge networks where storage, processing, and delivery closer to your network edge mean that your service reliability and quality are increased, and you have less local network problems and less global side effects. Improved timeliness of response. A well-run, large-scale cloud system typically has the ability to provide early detection of new malware deployments and can develop more effective and efficient incident response capabilities. And lastly, threat management. Cloud providers in general are large enough that they can afford to hire specialists to deal with specific security threats, while smaller companies can typically only afford to hire a small number of security generalists. They can also, cloud providers can provide audit and evidence gathering tools, including live virtual machines for forensics, if you've had a security incident, as well as cost-effective storage for logs and transparency as to your storage costs when it comes to audits. The resource concentration of the cloud means that you in general have cheaper physical perimeterization and physical access control because all of your resources are concentrated into data centers, but also easier and cheaper application of comprehensive security policies to your data, patch, and incident management, as well as your maintenance. The downside to having all of your resources concentrated like this is that it develops a risk in that your cloud is now a more visible target to attackers. The security controls listed here are some of the security controls that can be deployed for a defense in-depth model for the cloud, where you're looking to develop several layers of protection that work together to provide a deeper security for your cloud services. I won't actually read them all off here. Let's talk about recommendations for strengthening protection of your cloud environment. Let's talk about some general concepts first. Resilience versus resistance. This is a security concept that sometimes gets lost on certain IT departments in the enterprise, where resistance is where, the way I like to actually compare these two is to an individual that gets a cold. So you're getting sick. So resistance would be where you just draw a line in the sand and you say, you know what, I'm never ever going to get a cold ever again. We all know that that's probably not a realistic approach to take. Instead, what you're going to be looking to do is develop resilience to a cold, where you develop sort of a defense-in-depth way of preventing yourself from getting a cold in the first place. For example, good diet, plenty of sleep, washing your hands regularly, that sort of thing. Those will all be sort of defense in depth against colds. But then also mitigating in the event that you actually do get a cold, mitigating the effects that it has on you, getting plenty of sleep there and taking some time off and just taking care of yourself so that you recover quicker. These are all examples of resilience versus resistance. And the same can be applied to security, where you're not looking to just completely prevent an attacker from ever being able to get in, but make your environment so resilient that attack attempts are very easily detected and very quickly dealt with in a way that provides that minimal impact to your services and to your data. Security is a market differentiator. So customers will make buying choices on the basis of reputation for confidentiality, integrity, and resilience, and the security services that are offered by a cloud provider. This is a strong driver for cloud providers to actually improve their security practices and compete with each other on security as being a market differentiator. So customers will gravitate towards those cloud providers that offer the best or the most robust security. Rapid scaling of resources as a defensive measure can be an example of what cloud resilience looks like. Cloud providers can already scale storage, CPU, memory, virtual machine instances, and that sort of thing as technologies mature. The granularity of that control continues to improve. But cloud providers can also dynamically allocate resources for filtering, traffic shaping, extra encryption, and other things in order to increase support for defensive measures against things like distributed denial of service attacks and limit their effect. So you can look at rapid scaling of resources as being a resilient defensive measure that the cloud can provide and relatively easily. Most of the primary risks of using cloud computing can actually be compared to the risks of staying with traditional solutions, and the relative risks between cloud and traditional IT environments can then be used for cost-benefit analysis. So what I'm going to go through now is a 6-step framework for risk-based approaches to the cloud. Step 1 is to start your security planning early. This is the best way to really use this risk-based approach to planning so that you've got both eyes open. The first step is to think about the fundamentals, which is your data, your platform, and your users. Get to a point where you can understand your risk tolerance, identify the best deployment models based on security and compliance considerations, and detect potential exposure points for sensitive data and processes. With this information, you'll be in a much better position to understand what your organization really needs. Understand those business priorities first and their context. What drivers make cloud technology a good option for the work that you're looking to put into the cloud? Do you need to reduce cost? Do you need to be able to scale the system up and down, perhaps seasonally? Do you need to support mobile or remote workers? Then at the simplest, assets themselves supported by the cloud fall into 2 general categories: data and applications, functions, and processes. Once you've got your business priorities and your assets down, you can evaluate those assets for CIA. How important is the data or the function to your organization? How sensitive is it? How would you be harmed if it were made public, accessed by the cloud provider, manipulated, unexpectedly changed, or made unavailable for a time? Then map your assets to potential cloud service models. You need to determine which deployment models you'd be comfortable with. Before looking at providers, you need to know if you can accept the risks implicit to the various deployment models you've talked about with SPI. Evaluating those models in the context of your assets will give you a good idea of your comfort level for transitioning to the cloud and which deployment models and locations fit your security and risk requirements. Then evaluate potential cloud service models and providers. In this step, focus on the degree of control you have at each SPI tier to implement any required risk management. If you already have specific requirements like the handling of regulated data, you can include them in the evaluation. Then map out potential data flow. Most of the other steps that I've detailed so far are really high level, but it's imperative that with this particular one, data flow, you understand exactly where your data is going, so be specific. You need to know how data moves in and out of the cloud. You need to understand data flow between your organization, the cloud, and any external users or customers that you have. You need to pay close attention to where security capabilities can be enforced, monitored, and reported on as that data flows around. And you need to understand how the users will be accessing that data, what kinds of devices and what kinds of tool sets. Then you have a decision to make. You're equipped with an understanding of the importance of what you're considering moving to the cloud, your high-level risk tolerance, which service models are acceptable, a good idea of potential exposure points, and significant context to evaluate security and the security controls. So you can decide what you're going to do next. And this was all in step 1. Luckily, steps 2 through 6 aren't quite as complicated. Step 2 is to identify vulnerabilities for your selected service. Cloud computing depends on virtualization for operational savings and efficiencies, which means it has elastic boundaries, and it can push out the perimeter of your data center well beyond the reach of your security controls. So the best approach here is to review service architecture, layer your technologies using a defense-in-depth strategy like we talked about, and develop a strong security net that protects your data, your applications, platform, and your network at all levels. Protection at a hardware level enables security deeper into the data center and deeper into the infrastructure. Security at a hardware level can actually provide needed protection even below the hypervisor, which is an area of emerging threat in multi-tenant environments. So, when possible, protect at that lowest level. Steps 3, 4, and 5 are actually high-level things that you can do to mitigate security vulnerabilities in any environment. We're talking about the cloud today, but you can take these 3 steps and do them in your own environment to improve your vulnerability protection. First of all, you should know what it looks like when your application, service, or data is normal. In other words, it hasn't been compromised. You're going to need that as a baseline. Then you're going to need visibility into what is running in your environment and who is running it, so that you can trust that that infrastructure is reliable and that your infrastructure supports what compliance you need. A root of trust is where hardware and software trust each other, and not only will work with each other, but they can tell if they've been compromised. Roots of trust are very difficult to subvert and very quick to detect compromise. So going back a bit, step 3, make sure you're encrypting your data in motion, in process, and at rest. And then step 4, protect against those low-level attacks with the root of trust and integrity checking. Then finally, step 5, establish and verify identities before you federate by controlling access from trusted clients and trusted systems. Users and applications should be identified through your identity management system and trusting each other through their identity and access management policies before you put them into the cloud. The last step is step 6, choosing the right cloud service provider. The next several slides have a table of questions that you should definitely be asking your cloud service provider to make sure that they're meeting your specific security criteria. So what are the patch management policies and procedures that the cloud service provider performs? How does their technology architecture infrastructure impact their ability to meet their SLAs? Can they offer trusted pools for your most sensitive workloads? Is encryption a software-only solution, or do they provide hardware-level encryption? How are their systems, data, networks, management, provisioning, and personnel all segmented from each other? Are the controls segregating each layer of the infrastructure properly integrated so they don't interfere with each other? This goes back to isolation that we talked about early on. What cloud access and identity protocols are used? How is identity managed and authenticated? Can they handle multi-factor or at least two-factor authentication? How are their attacks monitored and documented? How quickly can they respond? And what recovery methods are used? How do they handle sort of the dynamic spin up and spin down of systems to predict availability and performance through normal business fluctuations? How do they handle that? How do they measure performance? Are they financially stable? How long have they been in business? Do they have a roadmap or a vision for what their cloud offering is going to look like, and a product a roadmap for that offering? And then what is the limit of their responsibility for security? This goes back to what we were talking about with the different SPI models as to how much responsibility the cloud provider is going to take versus the consumer. what security responsibilities are expected of you. What is your legal accountability in a breach? What is theirs? Do they have the ability to comply with regulatory requirements that you face? Are they able to provide you with full visibility into compliance-related activities? And would they allow you to perform your own audits against their systems? There's some legal concerns as well that I would recommend when strengthening protection of your cloud environment. You may want to have some additional review over standard contract clauses with regards to rights and obligations around breach notifications, data transfers, change of control, whether law enforcement would have access to your data, etc. Your legal team may want to see how much risk you can transfer to the provider versus how much risk you hold on to yourselves. The important thing to note with this is that you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource accountability. What that means is that if a risk leads to a failure of your business, really it's impossible for any other party to compensate for that kind of damage. So really the accountability always lands on you. And that also goes into transferring risk over commercial risk. Although it's possible to transfer many of the risks to a supplier, the true cost of transferring risk is really pretty rarely realized. For example, a security incident that results in the unauthorized disclosure of customer data could result in financial loss to the provider, but the negative publicity and loss of consumer confidence that you would have would definitely be felt by you or the end customer. Such a scenario highlights the importance of distinguishing risk versus commercial risk. The ultimate risk always remains with the end customer. And then lastly, because the cloud can be used to outsource critical internal infrastructure and the interruption of that infrastructure may have wide-ranging effects, the parties should carefully consider whether standard limitations on liability adequately represent allocations of liability within your contracts. This is a wish list of sorts on how cloud providers can help with increasing confidence for IT departments looking to leverage cloud solutions. Cloud providers could set and enforce security policies across clouds, which would give IT a common way to manage and ensure consistency of security policies across private and public cloud environments. They could create data boundaries, which would give IT greater control over where certain workloads can be run. They can ascertain whether their public infrastructure is high integrity and free of potentially damaging malware, and be able to demonstrate that they can detect changes to that integrity. This goes back to that root of trust. And then they can provide a way for consumers to compare security services offered by different public cloud service providers, which helps when consumers are looking to shop across cloud providers. In conclusion, the top points here should be that security should be something that you plan in from the very beginning. Step one of your risk framework, not bolted on afterwards in a series of gap assessments. Your top threats to cloud infrastructure and services really aren't that different than top threats to your own infrastructure and services. Responsibility for cloud security is a partnership between you and your cloud provider. Defense in depth is an important IT security concept that needs to be employed everywhere, especially the cloud. And using a risk-based framework and understanding what your security priorities are enables you to proceed with cloud implementations with both eyes open and fully aware of what your security risks can be. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, John. At this time, if there's any questions, we'll go ahead and take those now. If there are no questions, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. John, thank you for presenting Increase Your Confidence in Cloud Security. Following the conclusion of the webinar, we will be sending you a recording of the presentation. Thanks for attending.